Imagine an ordinary sunny day, quiet and calm, almost no one on the street except a boy on an old bicycle. He smiles, rushing forward, unaware that cold, hateful eyes are watching him closely. The next moment, there is a rumble, tires screech, and the world stops. This day will change his life forever. Hi friends, we know this story is breathtaking and makes your heart grow fonder. Tell us in the comments what your name is and where you're watching this video from. It's not just words. You're really important to us. Every comment, every like and subscription, you move us forward and help share stories like this with the world. Thank you for staying with us. You are our true support and inspiration. Enjoy the show. Dawn slowly colored the sky in delicate shades of pink and gold, softly illuminating the empty, quiet street on the outskirts of the small town. A light morning breeze fluttered the leaves of the trees, and only the occasional chirping of birds disturbed the complete tranquility of the surroundings. It was as if everything here was made for peace and comfort, and it seemed as if nothing bad could happen in this part of town. On the road, barely visible in the morning gloom, a boy rode his bicycle smoothly. James, a 14-year-old black teenager, was squinting excitedly at the first rays of sunlight. His eyes glowed with the simple childlike delight one gets from an ordinary bike ride. He was in no hurry. Summer gave him the rare freedom to savor every moment, and this quiet morning ride was a real escape for him. Every day on this street started the same way, and James loved that consistency. He knew every crack in the pavement, every turn, and especially loved breathing in the clean morning air. His family had moved to this neighborhood a few years ago, and though he had to get used to new neighbors, school, and friends, it was this street that had become something constant and reliable in his life. It was as if it waited for him every day, giving him a sense of calm and security. James thought about the future, about school starting in the fall, about the friends he had recently met, and about how he dreamed of becoming an architect and building houses for his family. Dreams of the future were his special joy, a little treasure he cherished in the back of his mind. Today he was especially happy to imagine that one day he would ride his bicycle not down this quiet street, but through the bustling and busy streets of the city, where new opportunities and exciting adventures would await him. Smiling at his thoughts, he continued pedaling, feeling the freedom these morning rides gave him. Through the dusty windshield of the old pickup, the world seemed dim and irritating. Thomas gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. It seemed to him that the reality around him was deliberately making him angry. Children laughing in the street, neighbors waving at each other, the sun shining too brightly. The anger that had been building up for years was boiling up inside him and now threatened to burst out. Thomas always considered himself a man of principle. He was proud of his roots, his family, and what he called his true values. But the world around him was changing too fast, and those changes were causing him to feel a sense of loss of control. He felt like he was being pushed out, that everything he knew and valued was being lost and replaced by something alien and incomprehensible. As he rode down the quiet street, he noticed a figure ahead. A black boy on a bicycle was rolling carelessly down the road, enjoying the morning sun. The image sent a wave of indignation through Thomas. Here they are, the new masters of life. He ran through his mind. It seemed unfair to him that someone could be happy while he himself felt only bitterness and irritation. An inner voice, full of venom, whispered to him, "They're taking everything from you. Your job, your land, your future." These thoughts, reinforced by prejudices and stereotypes, fueled the flames of hatred in him. He recalled news reports, conversations in the bar with people as embittered as himself, and all of this confirmed his distorted perception of reality. The boy in front was not even aware that he was being watched. His serenity irritated Thomas even more. How dare he be so happy? On my street, in my town, he thought. Each thought pushed him to the brink beyond which there was no return. The moment of decision came suddenly, but seemed inevitable. I have to teach him a lesson, show him who's in charge, Thomas thought. Stepping on the gas, the pickup's engine roared, and the car picked up speed. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline rushing through him, but not a shadow of doubt flashed through his mind. The distance between him and the boy was shrinking with every second. At that moment, it was as if time had slowed. He could see the wind playing with the boy's shirt, the boy looking over his shoulder, perhaps catching the sound of an approaching car. There was no compassion in Thomas's eyes, only cold determination. It's the right thing to do. This is the way it should be. he convinced himself, finally suppressing any vestiges of humanity. He turned the steering wheel slightly to the left, aiming the pickup straight at the cyclist. The moment their paths crossed, the world for Thomas merged into a single deafening sound, the sound of impact, a clang of metal, and a scream that seemed to pierce the air itself. But instead of the expected sense of satisfaction, he felt hollow. Something inside him shuddered, but anger immediately suppressed the feeling. Thomas continued driving forward without even looking back. His thoughts were chaotic, but he tried to justify himself. It's not my fault. It's his own fault. It's best for everyone. However, there was a seed of doubt in the back of his mind that would soon begin to grow, turning into an agonizing realization of what he had done. Thomas clutched the steering wheel, looking straight ahead. His attention was again drawn to a boy on a bicycle who was riding down the street with an ease and nonchalance that Thomas found almost offensive. In that moment, he saw in this teenager everything that he thought was ruining the world around him. His mind painted the picture in black and white, strangers in his own, enemies and friends, and the boy riding his bicycle became the embodiment of this alien. Thomas glanced at the figure of the teenager as it picked up speed. The boy was about 14, but he didn't pay attention to the car, just drove forward, staring at the brightening horizon. It didn't seem to occur to him that anyone might want to harm him, but Thomas felt a barely restrained irritation, as if the very thought that one of those whom he considered out of place dared to enjoy life offended him. They think they're allowed to do anything, he thought. These thoughts, like poison, filled him with hatred. It seemed to him that life in his hometown had changed, that the streets, once so dear, were now filled with strangers. The teenager in front of him became a symbol of these changes. He recalled moments when he was distressed by news of the privileges afforded to people of a different race, of how he thought the city was becoming unrecognizable. In each such memory, anger flared, strengthening his resolve. And here was this boy so carefree, as if he didn't see all his guilt. They're always like this, Thomas thought with venom, living in a foreign land, not respecting the local rules, not thinking of others. He convinced himself that his thoughts were quite logical, that he was doing the right thing. The alien child seemed to him the embodiment of all the injustices he felt he had encountered. Thomas clung to this image, projecting all his anger onto the boy. As it drew closer, Thomas felt a cold determination growing in his heart. He turned his head and caught the boy's gaze. The teenager, noticing the approaching pickup, looked back and their gazes met. James' gaze was surprised, clear, and there wasn't even a shadow of fear or suspicion in it, just a slight surprise that someone was watching him. In that instant, Thomas felt a kind of power, for the boy was looking at him without realizing what kind of man was behind the wheel or what he was about to experience. That sense of power fueled Thomas's hatred even more. They don't understand their place, ran through his mind, and with those thoughts it was as if he had made a final decision. He knew that not only would he be making excuses for himself, but he would think he was doing what he should have done a long time ago. Thomas's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. He looked once more into the boy's eyes and saw only incomprehension and childish carelessness. There was an insult in that look. They're always like that, he convinced himself. Let him remember it for life. Let him learn his lesson. Thomas stepped sharply on the gas. The engine of his pickup roared, swallowing the morning silence of the street, as if it were a harbinger of trouble. He could no longer see anything but the figure of the boy riding his bicycle. Unsuspecting, the steering wheel seemed to merge with his hands, and he sensed in that movement a kind of painful determination, devoid of reason but filled with cold hatred. It was all happening so fast that James didn't even realize the danger was approaching. It was only the noise of the engine, suddenly deafening, and the shadow of a huge car looming behind him that jolted him out of his serene state. He turned around, saw the pickup, and tried to react. But it was too late. Thomas, driven by his own inner demons, didn't hesitate for a second to only pushed harder on the pedal, shortening the distance to the boy. And at that moment there was an impact, sharp, deafening and terrible. The hood of the car slammed violently into the rear wheel of the bicycle. The crunch of metal, the squeal of tires, and the roar of the engine merged into a single, thunderous chord of violence. James felt his body thrown into the air as if he were a light toy. Unable to resist, the impact threw him off the bike, and he hovered in the air for a moment before collapsing heavily to the pavement. The first thing he felt was a sharp, piercing pain, as if his whole body were being pierced with hot needles. Fear spilled over his mind, but he couldn't scream or realize what was happening. The asphalt felt cold and hard, every pebble digging into his skin, and he realized with horror that he couldn't get up. The pain, unbearable and brutal, filled his entire being, burning out everything but the only thought, why? He heard the scraping of brakes, but the car stopped only for a moment before moving again. The driver of the pickup, that faceless silhouette that was the embodiment of horror, didn't even bother to look at him. James, unable to move, felt the world slowly sink into silence, broken only by his heavy, ragged breathing and the pounding of his own heart, which echoed in every corner of his body. The fog in front of his eyes grew thicker, but the question burned in his mind. Why had his life, filled with dreams and plans, been so suddenly shattered? Scraps of memories flashed through his mind, happy family faces, friends, laughter, and now, lying on the cold asphalt, he didn't understand how his usual bike ride had been so cruelly cut short. Passersby who had come out of their homes were cautiously approaching the scene of tragedy, and the faint shadow of the pickup truck still hovered over it, disappearing around the corner in the distance. James lay on the cold pavement, his body racked by an unbearable pain that overrode even the horror of what had happened. The pale morning sun, which only a moment ago had warmed his face and seemed kind and friendly, now seemed cold and indifferent, illuminating the scene of his desperate suffering. Everything around him frowsy and resonated in his mind like an echo of pain, an echo of an injustice he could not understand. The boy tried to move, but every inch of movement was met with a sharp, piercing pain. His body didn't listen. It felt alien, and the more he realized his situation, the more the feeling of powerlessness grew. He couldn't even lift his head to see what had happened to his bike, or where the man who had just crashed into him had gone. Every movement was torture, and fear paralyzed his mind, making him pray that this would turn out to be a terrible dream from which he would soon wake up. First he heard someone's quick footsteps. They seemed so loud, so resounding, as if the whole world had sharpened around him. The passersby, who had been alarmed to see the boy lying in the road, stepped cautiously closer, their eyes expressing horror and shock. James felt their gazes on him full of pity, but also fear. They didn't seem to know how to help him, standing at a distance, as if hoping someone else would take responsibility. "Please help me," James whispered, but his voice was quiet, barely audible. He thought he was screaming, but the words coming out of his lips sounded like a pathetic whisper. It made him feel even more humiliated. A scream was only a faint echo, lost in this world that was suddenly cold and alien to him. Among the people gathered, some called an ambulance, others talked fearfully, glancing at the road where the pickup truck had fled. No one dared to pursue the driver. No one risked trying to stop him or even memorize his license plate number. He just drove away, disappeared into the morning fog, leaving James alone with his pain and helplessness. Meanwhile, Thomas, the driver of the pickup truck, looked back in the rearview mirror, but what he saw only made him angrier. He felt a prick of fear, but suppressed it at once. Convincing himself that the boy had gotten what he deserved, it seemed to him that his action had been justified. There was not a shadow of regret, only a desire to get away, to disappear before anyone noticed his car. Lying on the pavement, James tried to say something again, but his voice was short. He looked at the people around him, trying to read support, hope in their eyes, but all he saw were helpless, fear-filled faces. He was scared not only from the pain, but also from the feeling of his total vulnerability. He felt humiliated to the core, lying in the mud in front of an indifferent, cold world, and at that moment all his dreams and hopes were shattered by the cruel reality. His lips barely moved, and he tried again to whisper, "Why?" But there was no answer, only the muffled hum of conversations and the distant wail of ambulance sirens that finally broke the empty silence, turning an ordinary street into a place of tragedy and pain. James woke up in a brightly lit hospital room, and the first thing he felt was a pulling, piercing pain. It seemed to come from everywhere, every cell in his body, every nerve responded to the agony. Slowly, bits and pieces of memory surfaced in his mind: the morning sun, a robe, the bicycle, and the deafening blow that had plunged him into darkness. The nurses and doctors were scurrying around with sympathetic faces, doing the necessary procedures. They were talking quietly among themselves, their eyes downcast, as if afraid to look James in the eye. With each day he spent here, he realized more and more that his condition was more serious than he wanted to believe. It seemed that every moment was devoted to the doctor's attempts to stabilize him, but no one dared to tell him the truth. A few days later, when the pain had subsided a bit, the doctors gathered James' family to explain the aftermath of the accident. The doctor, a tall man with a tired look, sat down next to James's bed. He tried to speak as softly as possible, picking his words like sharp glass shards that would inevitably hurt anyway. James's mother was sitting next to him, squeezing his hand, her eyes glistening with tears, but she didn't look away, trying to be strong for her son. The doctor explained that the accident severely damaged his spine and lower extremities. The injuries were so severe that surgery and recovery could not restore him to full mobility. The words sounded muffled, like a bad dream, but each one burned James from the inside out. Words he never wanted to hear were slowly forming a terrifying reality. "James, I understand how hard this is for you to accept," the doctor said softly, "but you won't be able to walk again. The damage is permanent, and even with rehabilitation and surgery, we won't be able to give you your mobility back." The world seemed to freeze. The words seemed to hang in the air, filling the room as James slowly digested their meaning. He was only 14 and hadn't yet had any losses in his life to prepare him for this blow. Just yesterday he had dreams, plans. He wanted to be an architect, wanted to build houses where people would be happy, wanted to go to the big city someday, to travel. But now all of that was gone, as if erased from the face of his future by one cruel movement of someone else's hands. He felt hot tears running down his cheeks. His mother gripped his hand tighter, but he couldn't look away from the emptiness in front of him. As if trying to make sense of it, he remembered the moment their gazes had met as in the driver of the pickup truck, who had deliberately pointed the car at him. Why? Those questions were tormenting him from the inside, but there was no answer. Weeks passed, and each day, James was immersed in a new realization of his situation. His whole life had changed. Simple actions, getting up, walking, even just turning around in bed became impossible. Each day in the hospital was a painful reminder of what he had once taken for granted. The pain was lessening, but there was another, deep, unending pain that gnawed at him from the inside. He watched the doctors who passed by, the patients recovering and coming back to life, and realized that for him, there would be no more of his old life. For James, the days in the hospital room stretched like an eternity. But it was here, in the silence and solitude, that he began to truly realize the extent of the changes in his life. Remembering happy moments, it was as if he were trying to hold on to an elusive past that now seemed elusive and almost fantastical. Not long ago, he had been an ordinary teenager with endless roads and opportunities ahead of him. He had dreamed, made plans, and believed that there was plenty of time ahead of him to realize everything he had planned. From an early age, James dreamed of becoming an architect. As a child, he loved playing with constructors, building intricate buildings, bridges, and streets. Later, studying city buildings, he imagined how he would build houses in which people would be happy. These dreams were a bright benchmark for him to guide him forward. He read a lot about architecture, watched documentaries, and spent hours sketching his fantasy buildings. All this filled him with joy, giving him the strength to overcome the usual teenage difficulties. But now his dreams of a career as an architect began to seem impossible. He could no longer imagine himself in the midst of a construction site, could no longer see himself in a job that required physical effort and freedom of movement. His body was confined to a wheelchair, and even simply going outside was now a difficult and almost insurmountable obstacle for him. Everything that had seemed so easy and accessible had become almost unattainable for him. The house he had returned to after the hospital now reminded him of what had been and what had become. His room, the walls of which were hung with drawings of future projects, had become a prison for him. Every detail of his surroundings reminded him of his former life, where he could get out of bed and go outside, ride his bicycle along the paths, free and full of dreams. Now, every time he passed the old bicycle, he felt the cold pain of loss. James began to spend a lot of time in silence, immersed in thoughts of the injustice that had come upon him. He replayed over and over in his mind the moment their gazes met with the driver's, when he felt the presence of evil and conscious intending to look It seemed to him that the world had just ruined his life for no reason, and that man in the pickup truck was a symbol of everything that had taken his dreams and future away from him. His family tried to support him, but he felt disconnected from them. They could get up, go outside, go about their business, all the things that were now impossible for him. He began to realize his dependence on others, and the feeling was almost unbearable for him. Every day, he felt more and more like a stranger in his own life, as if the old James was still there, on that quiet street, under the wheels of the pickup truck. The dreams began to fade, leaving behind emptiness and powerlessness. Now, when he closed his eyes, his fantasies were not about great buildings and daring projects, but about what it would be like to walk again, to feel the ground beneath his feet again, to breathe in freedom. In this silence and solitude, he began to realize that his life had been divided into before and after, and there would be no going back to that old life. Every day was now a struggle, not so much physical as internal, a struggle with the sense of loss, with the longing for unfulfilled dreams, and with the unrelenting pain of realizing that someone had taken it all away from him without the slightest hesitation. As James recovered, his family united in their determination to see justice done. They were appalled by the brutality with which their son had been treated and could not believe that the man who had committed such a heinous act was still at large. They felt that the world simply had to react, that the person who had robbed their son of his dreams and future should be given the punishment he deserved. James's family contacted a lawyer who helped them gather evidence, find witnesses, and prepare a lawsuit. James' mother, a woman with kind eyes and a strong character, painfully recalled the morning she received the call from the hospital about what had happened. Her son, her boy, had been brutally traumatized, and it was not an accident but a deliberate act of violence. She was willing to go through the ordeal to get to the truth, but the world around her was less fair than she wanted to believe. Each hearing was a challenge for the family. They often faced mistrust, implicit prejudice, and even outright contempt. The lawyer warned that it would be difficult. Their case would bring to the surface an undercurrent of hatred and bias that many are not prepared to confront. But James's family was steadfast in their resolve. James's father, a reserved and stubborn man who rarely showed his emotions, now attended court hearings daily, immersed in the fight for justice for his son. When the first hearing began, Thomas, the driver, still felt unfazed. He assured himself that he had done nothing really wrong, and that it was just a little lesson for the boy. In his angry and self-justifying inner world, he genuinely believed that he would escape the consequences. At the first sessions, he showed calmness, saying that he had just didn't see the cyclist and denied the charges, doing his best to avoid responsibility. James' family listened to his words with anger and pain. Every time Thomas spoke of accident and misunderstanding, it sounded like a mockery of their grief. It seemed to them that every comment he made, every false look he gave, was a new humiliation he was inflicting on their family and their son. Especially painful was the fact that his defense was trying to make James look bad, insinuating that maybe the boy wasn't looking around or was driving too fast. In a society that seemed alien and indifferent to them, the family also faced an invisible wall of prejudice. At every turn, they were met with hurtful and unfair comments. Some acquaintances looked at them with pity, but preferred to step aside so as not to get involved with a high-profile case. Others barely concealed their irritation, saying that the family was making a big deal of it, and some whispered that perhaps they were exaggerating for money. These remarks hurt the James family deeply, but they kept fighting. Fortunately, they were surrounded by those who stayed close and supported them. Friends, neighbors, a few activists who sympathized with them. Despite the risk of being in an uncomfortable position in society, these people helped James' family hold on, raised money for a lawyer, attended court hearings, and expressed their solidarity. The process dragged on, and each day the family struggled harder and harder. James's mother sometimes found herself unable to understand why the world they lived in refused to acknowledge obvious evil. But even when their faith in justice began to waver, when fatigue and bitterness at the bias of the judicial system threatened to break them, the family remained steadfast. Each time they saw James suffering, their resolve grew stronger. The family was ready to go all the way, realizing that this fight was no longer just about revenge. but about making sure the world heard their story. They knew they could never give their son back his dreams, but by achieving justice, they wanted to restore at least part of their faith in justice for themselves, for their son, and for those who might have been in their shoes. The trial began in an atmosphere filled with tension, anger, and cold contempt. In the courtroom, under the harsh light of the lamps, were James's friends and family, his parents, stiff with grief and determination, and a few witnesses, people who had seen the moment of the hit and run, or had seen Thomas behave with cold indifferent certainty afterward. But most of all, this room felt the presence of Thomas himself, the man whose hatred and cruelty had led to a tragedy that made the entire city shudder. Thomas, sitting at the defendant's table, held himself as if the events around him were of low concern to him. There was no remorse in his gaze, nor did he seem to feel any shame. He looked at the room, including James's parents, with an expression of barely concealed contempt. It seemed to him that he himself had been victimized, the victim of the nagging and stupid law that had chosen to punish him for what he thought was a righteous act. For Thomas, the trial was a humiliation, and his irritation only increased with each session. When he first testified, there was no hint of regret in his voice. Thomas claimed that he did not see the cyclist, that he accidentally lost control of the car, saw him too late and didn't have time to brake. But there was a cold falsity in those words. He sounded confident, almost cocky, and his tone left no doubt that he was just playing a role in front of the court. His lawyer picked up on this version, arguing that Thomas was a law-abiding citizen who had always helped the community and had never been seen to be aggressive. But to James' family, his words sounded like a mockery of their pain. With each day of the hearing, more details of the case came to light, and the stigma of racism and hatred that Thomas had tried so hard to hide became more evident. As the testimony of witnesses, eyewitnesses to the hit and run, many of whom claimed to have seen Thomas deliberately speed up, aiming the car directly at the boy, was read, Thomas's face darkened for a moment, but his lawyer immediately tried to challenge the witnesses' words in an attempt to discredit them, insinuating that they misunderstood and were too far away to see the details. However, the greatest resonance was caused by the surveillance footage, which James' family's lawyer managed to obtain. The footage showed Thomas watching the boy riding his bicycle for a few seconds and then speeding up, steering the car in his direction. The screen showed his eyes glittering with coldness and determination. When this footage was shown in the courtroom, many people's breath was taken away. The footage was terrifyingly clear, and it spoke silently of the coolness with which Thomas had carried out the hit and run. But even afterward, he continued to stand his ground, not admitting guilt, not showing an ounce of regret. Seeing the scene, James's parents couldn't hold back the tears. His mother held her hand to her face, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. The father stared at the screen with a frowning, grave expression on his face. His gaze, full of pain and rage, was fixed on Thomas, who still didn't seem to realize, or didn't want to realize, what he had done. He looked at them as if they were strangers, without the slightest guilt. On one day of the hearing, Thomas allowed himself to speak contemptuously of James and his family, describing the boy as one of the people who have taken over the place. His words had a bombshell effect in the hall. People whispered, some jumped up, demanding silence and respect. But Thomas felt his opinion was justified. He said that people like him were not supposed to be in this town, and that it was families like this that spoiled its image. These statements showed everyone his true face, full of hatred and racist prejudice. The judge reprimanded Thomas several times, but he continued to insist that he was innocent. His lawyer tried to soften his words, adding that Thomas had overreacted, but it was too late. The mask had been torn off, and the court saw a man who had defended his hatred to the last and was not going to admit his guilt. Each session was an agonizing ordeal for James' family. They looked at the man who had robbed their son of his dreams, hopes, and future, and realized that it meant nothing to him. James, who was brought to one of the sessions in a wheelchair, watched Thomas quietly. There was no anger in his eyes, just sadness and quiet determination. Thomas met his gaze for a second, but there was no remorse in it, only a contempt that reflected his lack of compassion. The trial was drawing to a close, and the tension in the room had reached a breaking point. The wait for the verdict seemed interminable, but the James family stayed until the end, hoping that justice would prevail. This trial was not only a struggle for the truth, but also a test of strength and fortitude. After the trial was over, Thomas left the courtroom, confident that he had escaped serious punishment. He still considered himself a victim of circumstance, and all the accusations and public outrage a mere unpleasant accident that would soon be forgotten. Soon, however, he began to notice that the world around him was changing, and not for the better. Like a shadow invisible to the eye, the curse of his deed began to follow him everywhere. The first blow was the loss of his job. The company where he had worked for many years decided to terminate his contract, citing behavior contrary to corporate ethics and a public scandal caused by a lawsuit. Thomas tried to defend his position, but management was adamant. He was fired with no possibility of reinstatement, and now he was left without a source of steady income. The sense of control that had always been so important to him began to slip away like sand through his fingers. The loss of his job led to serious financial difficulties. His closest friends and acquaintances, who had previously supported him, began to drift away, avoiding communication and reluctantly answering calls. Even those who had previously shared his views and supported him realized that Thomas had overstepped his bounds. He became increasingly lonely, and this sense of loneliness gradually crept into his daily life, leaving a bitter residue. Soon health problems began to arise. Thomas began to notice that he was often dizzy, and at night he could not sleep, waking up with painful nightmares. At first, it put it down to stress, but the symptoms only worsened. The agonizing sleeplessness, intrusive thoughts, and nightmares where he saw the boy hit by his pickup truck over and over again kept him awake. Sometimes he thought he could hear the echo of scraping metal, screaming and crying. The memory of what he'd done kept pounding into his mind, making it even harder. One time, when Thomas finally went to the doctor, he was told that his condition required serious treatment. The doctor described it as accumulated stress and post-traumatic stress disorder, which caused Thomas to become irritated. He didn't think he was at fault, but the symptoms wouldn't let him go. He began taking medication that temporarily dulled his anxiety, but deep down he realized that the source of his torment lay far beyond his physical state. His home, which had always been a refuge for him, now seemed bleak and cold. His dwelling became empty, uncomfortable. As if it repelled him, he began to see shadows on the walls, glints in the dark corridors that reminded him of a boy on a bicycle. Every corner, every sound reminded him of that day. He tried to get rid of these thoughts, tried to convince himself that it was just a play of imagination, but the fear was slowly eating away at him. One day, walking past a local store, Thomas heard someone whispering his name behind him, discussing whether he was the man who ran over the boy. The whispers filled him with more anxiety, and he felt the scornful glances of passersby who now knew the truth about him. His neighbors began to avoid him, trying not to meet his gaze, not to keep a conversation. Rumors that Thomas had escaped a just punishment spread, and many in the town who sympathized with James and his family made no secret of their hatred for Thomas. It was as if fate was taking revenge on him for what he had done. It was as if he had crossed a line, after which his life went down the drain. He found it harder and harder to hide his loneliness and despair. Everything that had once seemed solid to him was now crumbling: his job, his health, his reputation, the support of his acquaintances. Even his car, the instrument of that terrible accident, began to break down, as if it refused to serve him, reminding him of what he had done. Finally, he began to consider what had once seemed unthinkable to him. Was it really worth it? Was his hatred and prejudice really worth all that was happening to him now? Slowly but inevitably, he came to realize that all of this was the result of his own choices, his own cruelty and indifference. He found it increasingly difficult to drown out the voice in his head that asked again and again, "Why did you do it?" Thomas realized that he had ruined not only the boy and his family's lives, but his own as well. He had yet to realize the full extent of what he had done, but the consequences of his actions were beginning to reap rewards, plunging him into a darkness from which there seemed to be no escape. On lonely evenings, when the darkness thickly enveloped his house, Thomas began to sink into heavy, tormenting thoughts. With no one around to distract him, he was finally alone with himself and the weight of what he had done. Sick and tired, he slowly began to realize that the consequences of his action were not merely the result of an unfortunate accident, but a natural continuation of the choices and beliefs he himself had cherished for years. Thomas had always prided himself on seeing the world, clearly dividing people into their own and strangers, never doubting the rightness of his views, believing that everyone should know their place. But now he began to remember how this hatred began to grow inside him, gradually, day by day, filling his mind and forming a distorted perception of reality. All the events of that day began to come back to him with painful clarity. The look in the boy's eyes, the surprise in his eyes, the purity and defenselessness with which he looked at the world. Thomas found it harder and harder to convince himself that what he'd done was justified. He thought back to the moment he turned the wheel, pointing the car straight at James. It hadn't just been an accident or a lesson, it had been a cold decision he made, letting his inner evil take over. How could he? That question was tearing him up inside. He was beginning to realize that the second he decided to teach the kid a lesson, he changed not only James' life forever, but his own as well. His inner world became a tearing torrent of guilt and regret that rose whenever he tried to brush away thoughts of what had happened. He felt his old beliefs, which had once seemed so strong and justified, now turned against him, hurting him. Thomas tried to regain his former indifference, but it was impossible. His act was too heinous to be forgotten. He often caught himself thinking of James, how the boy, unaware of the impending threat, had driven down the street, thinking of his dreams and plans while he himself, Thomas, had destroyed his future in an instant. The image of James confined to a wheelchair began to haunt him. Thomas imagined how the boy now lived, greeting each morning with pain he didn't choose and didn't deserve. His life, filled with innocent dreams, was erased the moment Thomas decided to put him in his place. These thoughts became more and more intrusive, and Thomas could no longer drown them out. He found it hard to look at himself in the mirror, because behind the reflection, he saw the emptiness and cruelty with which he had once allowed himself to act. Guilt tormented him at night, and his dreams became nightmares, where each time, over and over again, he saw the very moment of the hit and run, the slow motion, the scream, the boy's fall to the pavement. He woke up in a cold sweat, staring into the darkness, horrified at the realization of his act. Now he was beginning to realize that the hatred that had been simmering inside him for years had brought him nothing but destruction. It had destroyed James and his family's lives. It had destroyed his own future, his job, his health, and his peace of mind. Thomas felt that it was this hatred growing in his heart that had destroyed everything that had once mattered to him. He began to realize that he didn't really hate the people around him, but perhaps he hated himself for his failures, for his emptiness and disappointment in life, for his preconceived notions, for his weaknesses. Hate became his weapon, his way of closing himself off from fear and disappointment. But this weapon, aimed at others, eventually came down on himself. The realization that now came to him carried with it an agonizing regret. Thomas might not have been able to forgive others, but now he would have to learn to forgive himself, if at all possible. The thought was becoming unbearable to him. For the first time in years, he felt real, alive. But this life was filled not with joy, but with pain and remorse. Every morning when he got out of bed, he felt his heart clench with the weight of what he had done, and realized that he would never be the same again. He was going to live the rest of his days with that burden, and he was beginning to realize that this was his punishment, to suffer for what he had done, to witness the devastation his act had brought to James and his family. The story of James and Thomas swept across the city and then far beyond, sparking a storm of emotion and discussion. People who heard about the tragedy were shaken to the core by the cruelty that had destroyed the lives of a teenager and his family, and showed the dark side of the hatred and prejudice that lived among them. The town where everything happened could no longer be the same. This story seemed to leave a mark on all its inhabitants, making them look at the world and each other in a new way. On the walls of the school where James studied, his drawings and sketches of the buildings he once dreamed of building appeared. Teachers and students initiated an action of remembrance, turning his sketches into a small exhibition. They wanted his dreams to live on, even if he himself had to give them up. Everyone who passed by these drawings felt the bitterness of knowing that these plans would never come true again. People saw not only James' talent, but also the cruelty with which his life was broken. It became a constant reminder of the tragedy and injustice that took away not only the boy's health, but also his future. James's parents, despite their grief, decided to talk about this story, to share it with others, to prevent this from happening again. They began speaking out to the community, attending meetings and public discussions about tolerance, racial prejudice, and the importance of justice. They knew they could not give their son his life back, but they believed that their struggle and honesty could make at least a partial difference in the lives of others. Their goal was to remind people of the need for tolerance and compassion. They said that hate always has consequences, and that anyone who allows themselves to be cruel and prejudiced destroys not only other people's lives, but also their own. Local activists and community members began raising funds for James' rehabilitation to help him find a new life in the conditions he had to get used to. They organized charity events, seminars, and meetings on the issue of tolerance. Over time, James' story has become a symbol for others who have suffered prejudice and injustice, and a reminder that everyone must realize the power of their actions and words. At one of the commemorative events, a small memorial was placed at the site of the tragedy. It was a simple but touching reminder for all passers-by. People came to the memorial, brought flowers, left notes and photos. One of the plaques read, "Don't let hate ruin someone's life." These words became a symbol of what society had to learn from this tragedy. Schools began introducing tolerance classes and holding meetings where adolescents and adults could discuss their experiences, fears, and prejudices. City authorities began to promote programs aimed at eliminating prejudice and teaching respect and understanding of each other. Many people began to reflect on how often they themselves let prejudice and hatred define their relationships with others, how easy it is to allow prejudice to take hold, and how destructive it can be to those around them. James' story and his suffering became an important lesson for all who heard it. People began to think more often that everyone has the right to respect and justice, that people should not be divided by skin color or other characteristics. It was a painful lesson, but it allowed many people to take a broader view of the world and realize that there is no place for hatred and aggression. This tragedy signaled the need for change in everyone's thoughts, hearts, and actions. The memory of the incident lived on, reminding people how important tolerance and justice are. Friends, this story is really hard and touching. Write in the comments what you think about it. Maybe some of you have also had cases when you faced injustice or bias. Share your thoughts and stories. Every comment you make is very important to us. We appreciate each and every one of you and are truly grateful for your support. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. It helps us to continue sharing important stories that remind us how important it is to respect and understand each other. We wish you a good day filled with warmth and kindness.